Nobody is really telling you this, but the plan to reach Mars is not actually about Mars. It is about who controls the most valuable piece of empty land in human history, and one company already has a serious head start that almost nobody understands. Stick around because later in this video, I'm going to tell you about the one forgotten NASA experiment from the 1960s that could decide whether humans survive on Mars at all, and the number is going to shock you. I am talking about the $100 billion plan to reach Mars and why the real story has almost nothing to do with rockets. Everyone assumes that this is a space race between countries like Apollo was. It's not. This is closer to a corporate land grab, a scientific gamble, and a political fight happening at the same time. And most coverage only shows you the shiny rocket footage. By the end of this video, you will understand the three barriers standing between us and Mars that have nothing to do with technology, and why the timeline everyone is excited about might be a complete lie. Let's start with the number itself. $100 billion sounds enormous, but here is what almost nobody mentions. That figure is not the full cost. It is roughly what SpaceX and NASA combined estimate just to get the first crewed mission there and back. The real cost of a sustained human presence, meaning actual bases, backup systems, and supply chains, could run past $500 billion over a few decades. Here is the part that gets buried a lot of the times. Most of that $100 billion is not spent on the trip to Mars, it is spent just getting stuff into Earth orbit first. Launch costs still dominate the budget, even with reusable rockets. Getting mass to Mars costs dramatically more than getting it to the moon. Fuel, life support, and radiation shielding eat up most of the budget than the spacecraft itself. Elon Musk has said publicly he wants to get the cost per person down to around $100,000 to $500,000. That is the same order of magnitude as buying a house. It sounds wild, but it is also the number that makes this entire plan even remotely realistic. Here is where it gets interesting, because the idea of a $100 billion Mars mission is not new. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush announced the Space Exploration Initiative, a plan to send humans to Mars. The estimated cost at the time was around $450 billion. Congress never funded it, and it quietly died within a few years. The same thing happened again in 2004 under President Bush with the Vision for Space Exploration, and again in the 2010s with NASA's Journey to Mars framework. Each time the plan got announced with fanfare, and each time funding dried up within a few years. So why does this attempt feel any different? Because for the first time, the money is not only coming from government budgets that can get cut in an election cycle, it is coming from a private company with its own revenue stream from satellite internet and commercial launches. That changes the entire risk calculation. This is the biggest lie about Mars colonization, that it has always been a technology problem. It has actually always been a funding stability problem, and that is the part almost nobody in mainstream coverage explains. You will never understand the real timeline unless you understand these three things. Radiation. Mars has almost no magnetic field and a thin atmosphere, so cosmic radiation hits the surface directly. A round trip could expose astronauts to radiation levels far beyond what is considered safe for a career on the ISS. This is where that forgotten experiment comes in. In the 1960s, NASA ran a lesser-known study called the Biosatellite program, sending organisms into high radiation environments to study long-term cellular damage. The data from that era still informs radiation shielding modules used today, and one conclusion from those decade-old tests still holds up. Shielding mass increases sharply for every additional layer of protection. That means the more you protect the crew, the heavier and more expensive the spacecraft gets. It is a problem that compounds instead of getting easier. Psychological isolation. The trip itself takes 6 to 9 months one way. Russia's Mars 500 experiment in 2010 to 2011 locked 6 people in a sealed capsule for 520 days to simulate this. Crew conflict, sleep disruption, and communication delays with Earth were bigger problems than any mechanical failure. Landing. Mars has just enough atmosphere to make landing hard, but not enough to make it easy. Engineers call this the 7 minutes of terror, because a spacecraft has to slow from over 12,000 miles per hour to a soft landing in that window, with no way for controllers on Earth to intervene since the signal delay is far too long. Here is what almost nobody talks about. This is not just a United States story. China's National Space Administration has its own Mars sample return mission targeted for the early 2030s, aiming to bring Martian soil back to Earth before any human mission arrives. The United Arab Emirates already has an orbiter around Mars called the Hope probe. Even smaller programs from India and the European Space Agency are contributing critical data on Martian weather and subsurface water. The reason this matters is legal, not just technical. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty says no nation can claim sovereignty over Mars, but it says nothing about companies. If SpaceX successfully establishes a permanent base first, there is a real unresolved legal question about what rights that gives them over resources, water, ice, and land use once people are actually living there. That is the land grab I mentioned at the start. It is not about planting a flag, it is about who writes the rules once someone is already there. Nobody talks about what happens after the first successful landing. The plan on paper is not one trip, it is dozens of Starship launches clustered around Mars' closest approach to Earth, which only happens roughly every 26 months. Miss that window and you wait over 2 years for the next chance. That is why the entire mission architecture is built around synchronized launch windows instead of a single heroic flight. If the current target holds, and that is a big if, given the history we just covered, the first uncrewed cargo missions could launch before 2030, with crewed missions following only once those landings are proven safe. So, is the $100 billion plan realistic? Or is it 1989 all over again with better marketing? History says be skeptical, but this time the money is not sitting in a government budget waiting to get out. If you want more videos breaking down the real science and history behind space exploration, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment telling me if you think humans will actually walk on Mars before 2040. I'll see you next time.